The first time I saw the human, I almost walked past him. He was sitting in the wrong seat. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Cadet Marcus Valen on the opening day of the Galactic Cooperative Academy's Advanced Tactical Operations program. Not his species. We had seen humans before, in the lower divisions, in the administrative wings, occasionally cleaning the atmospheric processors on Sub-Level 3. What startled my cohort was that he had seated himself in the middle row, third seat from the aisle, which was, by tradition dating back 400 cycles, the seat of the cohort's designated first, the highest-ranked incoming cadet, the one whose scores had cleared the entry threshold with the largest margin. That seat was mine. I am Vessels of Starlight Reaching, though my classmates call me Vel, as my full designation tends to cause microseizures in beings with fewer than 3 auditory processing nodes. I am Kurath. We are a tall, silver-skinned people with bioluminescent ridge markings that shift color with our emotional states, which, in that moment, were cycling rapidly between violet surprise and the deep amber of mild territorial irritation. "You are in my seat," I said. The human looked up. He had the standard bilateral symmetry of his kind, 2 eyes brown. I would later learn they called the color, though it seemed to me the shade of old mineral deposits, a flat expressive face, rounded ears that could not move independently, and a general softness of appearance that Kurath field doctrine classified as asterisk non-threatening at baseline. He wore the standard-issue gray cadet uniform. No honor markings, no achievement bands, just gray. He looked at the seat, looked at the number etched into the armrest, looked back at me. "Sorry," he said, and moved 1 seat to the left. That was how Marcus Valen introduced himself to the most elite tactical training program in 6-star systems, not with a declaration of lineage, not with a recitation of honors, not even with a firm territorial display. He said sorry and moved 1 seat to the left. My ridge markings settled into the pale blue of satisfaction as I took my seat. Around us, the rest of Cohort 7 filed in, 42 cadets representing 19 species, all of them carrying the sharp, bright energy of beings who knew they were the best their homeworlds had produced. The Dorathi twins folded their 8 limbs neatly beneath their shared bench. Cadet Prex of the Osean Republic clicked her beak twice in the traditional greeting. Cadet Threnody of Velm 9 simply lowered her 3 crests and hummed a greeting frequency that most of us felt more than heard. Marcus Valen opened a small paper notebook and began writing in it with a stick of graphite. Instructor Commander Yavithsal entered at precisely the scheduled moment. She was ancient even by Kurath standards, deep gold scales, eyes that had seen wars end and stars born, and she stood at the front of the room for exactly 30 seconds without speaking, letting the silence do the work that words could not. "You are the worst cadets ever admitted to this program," she finally said. Someone in the back made a sound of protest. Yavithsal silenced it with a look. "That is not an insult. It is a calibration. You were the worst cadets ever admitted to this program until you arrived here. What you do with that status is the only question this academy will spend 3 cycles answering." She walked the length of the front row, hands clasped behind her back. "You will be ranked. Continuously. In everything. Your rank determines your meal rotation, your equipment allocation, your simulation priority, your sleeping quarters temperature, in short, your comfort. The ranking system exists not to humiliate the low-ranked, but to give the high-ranked something to lose. Both functions are essential." She stopped in front of Marcus. "Cadet, state your species designation and primary assessed competency." He stood. Humans did this, stood when addressed by a superior. It was one of the more endearing holdovers of their military traditions. "Human ma'am, Marcus Valen, my assessed competency is," he paused, and for a moment something flickered across his face that I couldn't categorize. "General." Yavithsal studied him for a long moment. "General," she repeated. Yes, ma'am. Not tactical analysis, not weapons proficiency, not spatial navigation or biological adaptation or systems engineering. No, ma'am, General. She moved on, but I noticed, and I would think about this later, much later, that she did not seem displeased. She seemed, if anything, faintly interested. The first ranking assessment came at the end of day 3. Combat simulation. One-on-one in the Neuralink arena, where cadets fought not with their bodies but with their minds, controlling abstract strategic avatars in a contested star system scenario. 4 planets, 2 asteroid belts, limited resources, asymmetric starting positions. The goal was simple: achieve dominance of the system's central relay station within 60 minutes of simulated time. I faced Cadet Prex in the first round and dismantled her supply chain within 11 minutes. She was brilliant. Ossians always were at mechanical calculation, but she built in straight lines, and I had spent my childhood learning to think in spirals. I won my bracket. Marcus lost his. He lost it to Cadet Durrell, a Vorrigan male whose people had been conducting naval warfare since before the Kureth had invented written language. This was not embarrassing. Many cadets lost to Durrell. What was notable was how Marcus lost. He made the same mistake 3 times. Not similar mistakes, not variations on a theme, the exact same positional error at different scales in 3 separate engagements within the simulation. Durrell flanked him through the asteroid belt on the left side. Marcus countered too slowly. Durrell did it again at the planetary approach. Marcus countered too slowly again. Durrell did it a 3rd time at the relay station itself, and this time Marcus did not counter at all. Afterward, in the debrief, Yaveth dissected every cadet's performance in front of the full cohort. When she reached Marcus, she replayed the 3 flanking sequences side by side on the tactical display. "Can anyone identify the pattern?" she asked the room. Everyone could. We stayed silent anyway, because pointing out a cohort mate's failure in open debrief was considered poor conduct. "Cadet Valen," Yaveth said, "can you identify the pattern?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I left my left flank exposed in all 3 engagements." "Why?" Another pause, that flicker again. "I was watching something else." "What were you watching?" "Cadet Durrell's resource allocation patterns." Yaveth was still for a moment. "And what did you learn from Cadet Durrell's resource allocation patterns?" "That he front-loads his supply chains and leaves his rear logistics vulnerable after the first 20 minutes of engagement. If the scenario had lasted another 8 minutes, I could have collapsed his entire support structure from behind." The room was quiet. "The scenario ended in 42 minutes, Yaveth said. "You were eliminated at 34. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then she moved on to the next cadet. I turned to look at Marcus. He had his notebook open and was writing something. I could not read human script at the time, but I would later learn that what he wrote in that moment was a single line. "Durrell 20-min window, remember." Part 2, the bottom. By the end of the first month, the ranking was clear. I held first. Threnody of Velm 9 held second. Her species' hive-mind adjacent cognitive structure gave her an almost eerie ability to hold multiple tactical models simultaneously. The Dorathi twins, operating as a joint-traded unit, held third. Cadet Prex had recovered from her early loss and climbed to 4th through sheer mechanical precision. Marcus Valen held 42nd. Last, in a cohort of 42. It was not a gradual settling. He lost consistently, across every assessment format: combat simulation, resource management scenarios, diplomatic crisis modeling, physical endurance trials. The endurance trials surprised me most. Humans had a reputation for physical tenacity that bordered on legendary in certain military circles. I had read the histories of the Keth Durin siege. where a small human unit had held a position for 19 days against a force 20 times their size. But Marcus moved through the physical circuits like someone who was learning what his body could do for the first time, finishing last or second to last in nearly everything. What he did not do was complain. In 4 weeks of continuous assessment, during which the bottom 5 ranked cadets lost their climate control privileges, their priority meal access, and were assigned the least desirable bunk positions in the residential block, Marcus Valen did not complain once. He also did not stop taking notes. That notebook was always with him. In the observation bays after simulations, in the mess hall during what passed for leisure time, in the corridor before lights out. He wrote in it in that small, dense script of his, and occasionally he would pause and draw something diagrams, I eventually realized. Little maps of scenarios that had already concluded. One evening in the 6th week, I found him in the observation bay alone, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the notebook open across his knee, studying a star map on the wall display with the kind of sustained concentration that I had previously only seen in Elder Kurath scholars during deep meditation. My ridge markings shifted to pale green curiosity in my species' emotional spectrum. "You study the concluded simulations," I said. He glanced up without startlement. I noted that. Most species startled easily when surprised. Marcus seemed to have a very wide perimeter of awareness that made surprising him difficult. "Old habit," he said. I moved to stand beside him and looked at what he was studying. It was the map from Cadet Threnity's most recent win, a complex multi-vector engagement that she had resolved through an elegant pincer movement most of us had spent 2 days admiring. "Threnody executed that beautifully," I said. "She did," Marcus agreed. "She also won't be able to use that approach again." I looked at him. "She telegraphs it in her opening resource deployment," he said, gesturing at the display with his graphite stick. "She pulls a specific ratio of fast movers to logistics craft in the first 3 minutes when she's setting up a pincer. It's always the same ratio, different scenarios, same setup pattern." He drew the pattern in the air. "Once you know to look for it, you can bait her into committing to the pincer, and then collapse the arm she's not expecting you to touch." I stared at the display, then I stared at him. "How long have you been tracking this?" I asked. "Since day 5, he said. "You have been losing every simulation since day 2. "Yes," he said. "You have been deliberately losing." He made a small sound that I had learned was a human expression of gentle amusement, not mockery, not cruelty, just the warmth of something shared. "Not deliberately," he said. "I've been losing because I'm not as fast as Dural, not as precise as Prex, not as cognitively parallel as Threnody, and not as experienced as the twins. Those are real deficits. I'm actually trying." He paused. "But losing has kept me in a position where people stop paying attention to what I'm studying." The observation bay was very quiet for a moment. "You are gathering intelligence," I said slowly. "I'm a student," he said. "That's what students do. Most students study to win the next assessment." "Most students," he said agreeably, and turned back to the display. I stood there for a long moment, my ridge markings cycling slowly through colors I did not immediately recognize in myself, something between respect and unease and a deep, deep curiosity. Then I went to my bunk and lay in the dark, and thought about the fact that the worst cadet in Cohort 7 had been, for 6 weeks, quietly building a complete tactical dossier on every single one of us. Part 3, The Gathering. I began to watch him differently after that. Not obviously, I was Kurath, and we were trained from youth to observe without appearing to observe. But I started to map his movements the way he had been mapping ours, and what I found dismantled several assumptions I had been carrying without examination. First, he was not as slow as he appeared. In the physical circuits, Marcus consistently finished near the bottom, but if you watched how he ran the courses rather than simply clocking his times, you noticed that he never ran the same line twice. Every circuit, he varied his approach, different pacing patterns, different recovery techniques, different routes where the course permitted variation. He was not racing. He was experimenting. He was running the course as a scientist runs a series of trials, eliminating variables, identifying optima. By the 12th week, his times had improved by enough that he had climbed from 42nd to 38th in the physical component. It was not dramatic. No one celebrated or remarked on it, but I had his times memorized from the beginning, and the trajectory was not random. Second, he slept less than any other cadet. The dormitory lights cycled off at the 22nd hour and on again at the 6th. I did not sleep well. Kureth often don't in artificial gravity, and I sometimes lay awake in the small hours watching the faint glow of Marcus's bunk across the room. His bunk was dim-lit for exactly 2 hours after lights out every night, and then dark for 4 hours, and then he was up again before the 6th-hour bell. He was sleeping approximately 4 hours per night with apparent functionality. I looked this up. Human optimal sleep requirement was typically 7 to 9 hours. 4 hours was classified as significant deprivation in their medical literature. I mentioned this to him on a rest day, as diplomatically as I could. "You are operating at a measurable cognitive deficit," I said. He looked at me with those brown eyes that were somehow both tired and entirely alert. My dad used to say that the willingness to do the uncomfortable thing that your competition isn't willing to do is the only truly reliable edge. Your father was a military strategist. He was a mechanic, Marcus said. He fixed broken machines in a factory for 30 years, but he was very good at it. I did not know what to do with that, so I said nothing. Third, and most important, he had begun to build relationships in the cohort that no one was talking about. The Durathi twins, Kest and Laurel, were insular by nature. Vorrigan social bonding required significant time investment and was not typically extended to non-Vorrigan. And yet I noticed that Marcus spent mealtimes near them at least twice per week, and the three of them sometimes remained at the table after other cadets had left, with Marcus's notebook open between them. Whatever they were discussing, the twins did not seem displeased by it. Cadet Prex, who had seemed politely indifferent to Marcus since the opening simulations, had been overheard by at least 2 cadets explaining Ossian mechanical calculus to him in the engineering lab, voluntarily, without prompting, with the particular focused engagement she reserved for problems she found genuinely interesting. Even Threnody, whose Velmian social customs ran to minimal direct interaction outside of operational necessity, had begun acknowledging Marcus with the 3-crest dip that in her culture signified worthy of notice. He was not charming them. He was not flattering them. As far as anyone could tell, he was asking them questions about their homeworlds, their tactical traditions, their ways of seeing strategic problems, and then listening with a quality of attention that I was beginning to understand was its own kind of gift. "He is strange," Cadet Durrell said to me one afternoon, having apparently arrived at this conclusion after 6 weeks of independent analysis. "Yes," I agreed. "He asked me to walk him through the Vorrigan 7 breach naval doctrine," Durrell said. "All of it. Not a summary, the full doctrine." "What did you say?" "I told him it would take 3 hours." Durrell paused. "He said he had 3 hours." We looked at each other. "It is strange," Durrell said again, more quietly this time and not exactly as if it were a complaint. Part 4, the shift. The mid-cycle grand assessment arrived in the 14th week. Unlike the regular simulations, the grand assessment was not a one-on-one or small-team exercise. It was a full cohort war game, all 42 cadets divided into 2 opposing fleets, with Yavith Sal designing the scenario parameters personally and refusing to reveal them until the moment the exercise began. The cohort's own internal ranking determined team captaincy. First and second in overall ranking led the opposing fleets. I led Fleet Aurum, Threnody led Fleet Viral. The teams were assigned by random draw. Marcus ended up on my fleet. I will be honest. My initial reaction was relief that he was not on the opposing side, followed immediately by the tactical calculation that he was likely to be my weakest asset, and I should place him where he could do the least damage to our overall performance. I assigned him rear logistics coordination. It was, essentially, the role of making sure supply ships followed the correct routes at the correct intervals, important enough that I couldn't leave it unattended, simple enough that even poor performance wouldn't cascade into a larger failure. He accepted the assignment without comment. The scenario Yavithsal revealed when the exercise began was unlike anything we had faced in the preceding 14 weeks. It was not a symmetric engagement. It was not a resource control scenario. It was an asterisk rescue operation. A civilian convoy stranded in a debris field at the edge of a contested system, with both fleets competing not to destroy each other, but to reach and extract the convoy first, while the other fleet attempted to block them. Combat was permitted but not the primary objective. Speed, navigation, and logistical coordination were everything. I spent the first 4 minutes reformulating my entire opening strategy. In the 5th minute, Marcus Valen's voice came through my command channel. Captain Vel. Request permission to speak. Speaker. I need you to give me the logistics wing. I was in the middle of redirecting 3 fast attack units around a debris cluster. You have the logistics wing. That's your assignment. I mean all of it, he said. All 12 supply vessels, the 2 coordination hubs, and the routing authority for fast movers requesting resupply in the first 30 minutes. I paused. That is operational control of our entire rear infrastructure. Yes. Explain your reasoning in 30 seconds. What he said in those 30 seconds made me go very still. He had identified, from the scenario parameters Yavithsal had just released, that the debris field configuration would create exactly 2 navigable corridors into the extraction zone. Both corridors were wide enough for fast attack craft but too narrow for standard supply trains. The conventional approach, which Threnody would almost certainly use, because it was the fastest conventional approach, was to send your extraction fleet in light and fast, and sustain it with intermittent supply drops from vessels holding at the corridor entrances. The problem with that approach was the debris field's rotation rate. Marcus had done the calculation in his head, or perhaps, more likely, had done it on paper in the 4 minutes since the scenario began, because the notebook was never far from his hand, and the corridor widths would narrow by approximately 40% in the second 30 minutes of the exercise, as the debris field's outer ring rotated into a tighter configuration. If your supply chain was set up for standard corridor entrance staging, you would be unable to reconfigure it quickly enough when the corridors narrowed, and your extraction fleet would be cut off from resupply at the critical moment. Unless someone had spent the entire first 30 minutes threading light, single-vessel microsupply runs through the corridor at its current wider configuration, pre-positioning cached supplies inside the debris field itself, so that when the corridors narrowed, the extraction fleet could draw from interior caches rather than exterior staging. It was, he explained in 30 seconds in a flat, calm voice, the only logistical approach that remained viable through both phases of the debris field's rotation. No one else had calculated the rotation rate. I checked my own tactical display while he was talking and confirmed it. The data was there, embedded in the scenario parameters, available to everyone. No one had looked for it. Granted, I said. Full logistics wing, routing authority, complete control. Do it. Thank you, Captain. What followed was, and I have reviewed the recording many times since. One of the most precise logistical operations I have ever observed in a training environment or otherwise. Marcus did not command the logistics wing like a cadet who had been assigned a supporting role. He commanded it like someone who had been studying every vessel's capabilities, every operator's strengths and weaknesses, and every corridor variable for an exercise that had not yet been announced, which was of course impossible, except he had been studying everything. For 14 weeks from last place in the rankings, invisible and unremarkable, he had been studying everything. He threaded supply vessels through that debris field in patterns that should not have worked and somehow did, coordinating with the Dorathi twins, who were running our heavy extraction units, in a fluid, rapid shorthand that suggested considerably more prior coordination than a single mealtime conversation could account for. He used Cadet Prex's mechanical precision to run a calculation-intensive resupply timing matrix that freed him to focus on real-time debris field adjustments. He even looped Cadet Durrell into a flanking feint that drew two of Threnodi's blocking units away from the primary corridor for 7 critical minutes. At the 31-minute mark, when the corridors narrowed exactly as he had predicted, our extraction fleet had full access to interior supply caches and continued its run without interruption. Threnodi's fleet, which had set up the conventional staging approach, found its supply chain suddenly unable to thread the narrowed corridors. Her extraction unit slowed, then stalled. We reached the civilian convoy with 6 minutes to spare. The observation bay was very quiet when Yaveth stopped the simulation clock. Then she said, in a voice I had never heard her use before, low and deliberate and carrying something that might have been satisfaction, "Cohort 7, you will take a 15-minute recess. When you return, we will discuss what just happened." Part 5, what was always there. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Yaveth did not begin with me. She did not begin with Threnody, whose fleet had lost. She began with Marcus. "Cadet Valen, walk us through your debris field rotation calculation." He stood and walked to the tactical display, and did exactly that calmly, step by step, showing the embedded data points in the scenario parameters, the rotational physics of the field's outer ring, the corridor width projections at 15-minute intervals, and the prepositioning supply cache strategy that followed from those projections. He did it the way someone explains something they have understood completely, without the hesitation of someone reaching for knowledge and the false clarity of someone performing expertise they don't have. He just explained it, in plain language, and every cadet in the room followed it, and by the time he finished, there was a particular silence in the room that I recognized as the silence of 41 people recalibrating something. "When did you calculate the rotation rate?" Yaveth asked. "During the scenario parameter review," he said. "First 3 minutes. No one else calculated it." "I know, I was watching." "Why were you looking for it when no one else was?" There was a pause. Marcus seemed to consider this seriously, not as a performance of consideration, but as a genuine moment of working out how to say something accurately. "I've always been slower than the people around me," he said. "In school, at home, in every environment I've been in before this, I process things differently. I can't hold as many simultaneous models as Cadet Threnody. I can't calculate as fast as Cadet Prex. I can't execute as precisely under pressure as Cadets Kest and Laurel." He named each of them without looking at them. "So I've learned to find the thing that no one else is looking for. Because the thing no one is looking for is usually available to everyone. It's just that the fastest and most precise people don't need to look for it. They can win without it." The room was very quiet. "The rotation rate data was in the public parameters," he continued, "available to all of us. I looked for it because I had time to look for it. I had time to look for it because I've been finishing last, and finishing last means no one is watching what you study." Yaveth looked at him for a long moment. "Cadet Valen," she said, "what is your primary assessed competency?" He almost smiled. "General," he said. The ranking reallocation that followed the grand assessment was significant. My fleet's victory contributed to score updates across the board, and Marcus's individual contribution, logged and weighted by the assessment protocols, moved him from 42nd place to 23rd in a single evaluation. 23 places in one assessment. In the history of the program, according to records Yavithsal shared with us in a rare display of institutional transparency, no cadet had moved more than 11 places in a single grand assessment. But the number, remarkable as it was not the thing that stayed with me. What stayed with me was what happened the evening after the debrief, when the cohort had dispersed to their various routines and I found myself again in the observation bay. Marcus was there, as he often was. The notebook was open. He was writing. "You knew," I said, "before the grand assessment, you had already built this strategy." He looked up. "I had built pieces of it. I didn't know the scenario. I had contingency approaches for several scenario types." "How many?" 14. I sat down across from him. "You have been ranked last for 14 weeks. "Yes." "And you were developing 14 contingency strategic approaches for a cohort-wide scenario that might never have used any of them." 15 now, he said. "I thought of a new one during the debrief." I looked at him for a long time. My ridge markings were cycling through colors that I couldn't quite catalog, not any single emotion but many at once, layered, which was unusual for my people. "Why did you apply for this program?" I asked. "In your entrance evaluation, your scores, they were not low, but they were not exceptional. You qualified, but only barely. You must have known you would be competing against cadets who had been preparing for this their entire lives." "I knew," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet I noticed something I had not noticed before, that the tiredness in his eyes, the constant low-level tiredness of someone sleeping 4 hours a night for 3.5 months, was not the tiredness of defeat. It was the tiredness of someone who had been working very hard on something they cared about enormously. "My homeworld," he said, "doesn't have a great relationship with the cooperative." I knew this. Human integration into the galactic cooperative was recent and contested. There were political factions on both sides who viewed the arrangement with varying degrees of suspicion. "There's a perspective," he continued, "in certain cooperative circles that humans are useful for manual labor and biological diversity, but aren't suited for," he paused, choosing his words, "complex strategic thinking, long horizon planning, the kind of cognition that the program develops." I could not dispute that this perspective existed. I had encountered versions of it myself, and I was ashamed of how little I had challenged it. "I want to be a fleet officer someday," he said. "Not a logistics coordinator, not a support specialist, a fleet officer, which means I need this program and I need to finish it and I need to actually be good enough to command." He looked at the display wall where the debris field scenario was still loaded from the debrief. "I can't be the fastest. I can't be the most precise. I can't hold the most simultaneous models, but I can be thorough and I can be patient and I can find the thing that the fastest and most precise people don't need to look for." He paused. "If that's enough, I want to prove it." "And if it isn't enough?" I asked. He looked at me with those tired, alert, entirely unsentimental brown eyes. "Then I'll figure out what is," he said. Part 6, the long game. The second half of the cycle was different. Not because Marcus suddenly became the fastest or the most precise. He didn't. Durrell still outpaced him in combat simulation. Prex still outstripped him in mechanical calculation. Threnody still held more strategic models in parallel than Marcus could consciously manage. But the cohort had recalibrated, and recalibration changed the shape of everything. Cadet Durrell began, quietly, to ask Marcus to review his scenario approaches before major assessments. Not for permission, Durrell was not built for deference, but for the particular kind of second opinion that Marcus had demonstrated he was capable of providing, the finding of the thing no one else was looking for. Durrell would present his strategy, Marcus would study it for a few minutes, and then Marcus would say something like, "What is the debris rotation rate?" Or "What happens to your supply chain in hour 2 if the corridor narrows?" Or simply, "What are you not checking?" Durrell's performance in the second half assessments improved markedly. Prex began sharing her pre-assessment mechanical calculations with Marcus, initially because she wanted someone to verify her work, and he was the only cadet available in the lab at 4 in the morning. She discovered that he could not check her calculations. He did not have her processing speed or precision, but he asked questions about them that occasionally revealed assumptions she had made without realizing she had made them. She called it, in the precise Ossian idiom, the value of a well-placed outside ignorance. Threnody, in her minimal contact way, simply began leaving her scenario analysis notes in a location where Marcus could read them, and Marcus began leaving his own notes in a location where she could read them, and neither of them ever directly acknowledged this exchange, but both of their performances in the final quarter assessments showed evidence of having incorporated things they had not previously incorporated. The Durathi twins were perhaps the most interesting development. Kest and Laurel had been operating as a near-perfect joint unit since their arrival, their twin bond giving them a coordination advantage that non-Vorrigan cadets could not replicate. But joint units had a known vulnerability. They could fail to account for the perspective of beings whose cognition did not mirror their own. In 3 second-half assessments, the twins incorporated a third planning voice into their pre-simulation strategy sessions. That voice was Marcus. He was ranked 23rd after the grand assessment. By the end of the cycle, he was 12th. The final cycle assessment was held on the last day of the academic year. Unlike the grand assessment, which had been a fleet versus fleet engagement, the final was individual. Every cadet faced the same scenario in isolated simulation, with no assistance, no communication, and a time limit that Yeveth had selected specifically to make completion under standard approaches impossible. The scenario was this: a 3-system conflict, multiple faction engagement, civilian population protection objectives layered over military victory conditions, with a resource constraint that made achieving all objectives simultaneously impossible using any standard doctrine in any tactical tradition represented in the cohort. You could win the military engagement and lose the civilian protection score. You could protect the civilians and lose the military engagement. You could attempt to balance both and likely fail at both. There was no clean solution. This was, I realized as I read the parameters, intentional. Yeveth had not built a scenario with a correct answer. She had built a scenario designed to reveal how each cadet handled the absence of a correct answer. I worked through it for 2 hours and produced a strategy that sacrificed 30% of the civilian protection objectives to achieve a military outcome that would, in the medium term, create stability likely to protect more civilians than the immediate protection objective would have saved. It was defensible. It was not comfortable. I submitted it. Most of the top-ranked cadets made similar calculations, varying in the specifics of how they weighted military versus humanitarian outcomes. Durrell's solution was more militarily aggressive and took heavy civilian protection losses. He had grown up in a culture that treated military victory as the prerequisite for all other goods. Prex's solution was mechanically precise and deeply uncomfortable to read, because her calculation had stripped every trace of moral reasoning from a decision that was fundamentally moral. Threnady's solution was the most sophisticated, holding 7 simultaneous strategic threads in elegant tension, but it assumed a level of perfect information sharing between factions that the scenario parameters did not support. Marcus submitted his assessment in the final 20 minutes of the time limit. I know because I asked Yevethsal afterward, and she told me, which she did not do for every cadet, which I understood to mean she had found the answer worth examining in detail. He had done something none of the rest of us had done. He had not tried to optimize the scenario. He had spent the first 40 minutes identifying not which objectives he could sacrifice, but which assumption in the scenario structure itself was creating the apparent impossibility. And he had found one. The resource constraint that made simultaneous achievement of all objectives impossible was tied to a specific resupply route that all standard doctrine assumed was the only available route, but embedded in the scenario's background geography, in the kind of detail that scenario designers often include for texture and realism without intending it to be operationally significant, was a secondary route. Slower, higher risk, requiring prepositioned caches that would take resources from the first phase military engagement. It was not a perfect solution. The military engagement in the first phase was harder without those resources, and Marcus's submission acknowledged the increased risk explicitly. But it was the only submission that achieved all three primary objectives: military victory, civilian protection, and strategic stability in the third system. It was slower and more difficult than any of the approaches the top-ranked cadets had taken. It had found the thing no one else was looking for. Part 7, the name. Final rankings were posted on the first day of the new cycle, compiled from the full year's cumulative assessments. I held first, Threndi held second narrowly, the Dorathi twins held third, Prex held fourth. Marcus Valen held seventh. Seventh in a cohort of 42, after opening the cycle in last place. There was a ceremony. There was always a ceremony, the cooperative loved ceremonies. And at the ceremony, Instructor Commander Yevethsal gave a speech that I will remember for the rest of my life, though not for the reasons I expected to remember it. She spoke about the program's philosophy. She spoke about what the rankings were designed to do. She spoke about the cohort's collective performance, which she described as the strongest she had seen in 11 years of instruction. And then she said something that she had never, by her own account to me afterward, said at a graduation ceremony before. There is a cadet in this cohort, she said, whose performance this cycle I want to specifically address. Not because it was the highest ranked, or the most technically precise, or the most strategically sophisticated in the conventional sense, but because it demonstrated something that the ranking system cannot fully capture, and that I believe this cohort should carry with it into whatever service lies ahead. The room was still. Military training systems, she continued, are designed to identify and accelerate the already strong. They find cadets who are fast and make them faster. They find cadets who are precise and sharpen their precision. They find cadets who can hold many models simultaneously and expand that capacity. This is good. These are valuable capabilities. The cooperative needs them. She paused. What training systems do not reliably produce, and what cannot be trained in the conventional sense, because it is a disposition rather than a skill, is the practitioner who operates sustainably at the frontier of a domain they did not inherit, who enters an environment of genuine disadvantage, and rather than seeking to minimize the disadvantage, seeks to understand the environment so completely that the disadvantage becomes a different kind of perspective. She looked at Marcus. Cadet Valen, she said, you will stand. He stood. At the end of the first day of this cycle, you were seated incorrectly. A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite recognition, something between them moved through the room. You apologized and moved one seat to the left, she said. You have been moving in the correct direction ever since. She let that settle. Seventh in final ranking represents a remarkable individual achievement, and I want the cohort to acknowledge it. But what I specifically want to commend, for the record and for this cohort's collective memory, is the method. In 14 weeks of finishing last in nearly every assessed category, Cadet Valen built a more comprehensive understanding of this cohort's tactical capabilities, vulnerabilities, and coordination potential than any of the top-ranked cadets, including myself, had fully mapped. She said this without embarrassment. I admired that. He used that understanding not for individual advantage in the ranking sense, but to improve the collective performance of everyone he was in proximity to. Durrell is a better tactician for conversations he had with Cadet Valen. Prex is a more assumption-aware analyst. Threnody, she glanced at our second-ranked cadet, has begun accounting for cognitive frameworks outside her own natural architecture. Threnody dipped all three crests at once, which in Velmian custom was extremely high acknowledgement. This is not a story about one human cadet overcoming the odds, Yavithsal said, and her voice had dropped now into something that I recognized as the register she used when she was saying the thing she most wanted said. This is a story about what thoroughness and patience and genuine curiosity about the perspectives of others can produce over time. These are not dramatic capabilities. They do not show well in early assessments. They do not produce spectacular first impressions. She held Marcus's gaze. They produce fleet officers, she said, that people follow willingly into situations where following is terrifying. Because those officers have already thought about what no one else thought to look for. Epilogue, Vel's testimony. This account was composed 3 years after the events it describes, at the request of the Galactic Cooperative Academy's Historical Documentation Office, which has begun a project of collecting first-person accounts of notable cadets for the purpose of institutional learning. I am now a fleet captain. Threnody is my strategic officer. The Durathi twins hold joint command of our escort wing. Prex coordinates our technical operations division. Marcus Valen is my executive officer. He is still not the fastest. He is still not the most precise. He still does not hold as many simultaneous strategic models as Threnody. He still carries a small paper notebook and writes in it with a graphite stick, which causes no small amount of gentle bewilderment among younger crew members encountering it for the first time. Last month we faced a navigational emergency in the Tesseran corridor, a debris field of unexpected density at a junction point that was supposed to be clear. The standard approach was unavailable. The two fastest approaches both carried a significant probability of catastrophic hull contact. Marcus asked me for 12 minutes. He got 11. What he found, embedded in the Tesseran system's geological survey data from 6 years ago, was a third corridor. Narrower, slower, requiring a specific entry angle that none of our navigation systems had flagged, because the survey data was archived in a format incompatible with our current navigation suite, and therefore not visible in our standard operational display. He had found it by going to the raw geological archive, the one that required manual retrieval. He had found the thing no one else was looking for, because no one else had thought to look for it there. We cleared the corridor without incident. Afterward in the command center, someone, a young Ossian ensign, first cycle out of the academy, precise and fast and tremendously impressed with herself, asked Marcus how he had thought to check the geological archive. Old habit, he said. And then he went back to his notebook. I have given many accounts in my time of the cadets and officers I have served with, but I find that this one, when I try to summarize it, resists summary in the way that important things often do. What I can say is this. When Marcus Valen was the worst cadet in his class, he was already the most thorough. He was already the most patient. He was already finding things the rest of us were not looking for and storing them carefully and waiting. We mistook the waiting for losing. We were wrong. And, word count, approximately 9,700 words. Estimated runtime, 62 minutes at 160 WPM. Title: Human student was the worst in his class until he revealed his true power. Film Seed DNA, Xenobites 2008. Outsider harboring hidden capability, underestimated by environment. Systematic patience as power. Collective transformation through one individual's unseen work.